Hi, everyone. Welcome to Wavemaker Live. Throughout March, we've invited some of our most inspiring women in our network to share their own perspective on what it means to be a woman in marketing today, specifically how they've seen it evolve throughout their own career and how brands that they work at have a huge part to play in shaping culture and public perception, and all in the name of embracing equity for women throughout March, which is Women's History Month, and hopefully much beyond that too. So far, as part of this series, we've had the pleasure of speaking to Seren Enna from L'Oréal Paris in Indonesia and Jenny Krasinski from Colgate-Palmolive. Both of these women have shared some really incredible initiatives that their brands have put forward, things such as kind of tackling street harassment through to democratizing technology education for everybody. And today I have the real pleasure of introducing you all to the wonderful Meredith Howard, who is joining us from Deloitte. So hello, Meredith.
Hey, Katie. Thanks for having me.
Very welcome. Very glad to have you. So Meredith joins us. She's an award-winning digital marketer and social media strategist, and she's based in Austin, in Texas. In her role at Deloitte, she leads the team behind their global web, social, and advertising strategies. And her passion in that role is really about defining kind of the best content and overall experience for audiences who are interacting with the Deloitte brand across their digital channels. She's also led digital marketing strategy for Deloitte's major partnerships, which include things such as their presence at World Economic Forum, at COP, and then more recently in preparation for upcoming Paris 2024 Olympic and Paralympic Games. And Meredith is also an educator and a speaker in the field of marketing. So beyond her world of work, she's taught as an adjunct professor at St. Edward's University. She has designed marketing workshops for General Assembly and spoken across the US on the topic of digital marketing at conferences including South by Southwest, Social Media Week, and Digital Summit. A very impressive bio, Meredith. Would you like to briefly introduce yourself and your current role at Deloitte?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. It's fun to hear it back, You spend some time writing your bio, and then you're like, oh, wow, that actually sounds impressive. I guess I have been up to something this last decade. So my role at Deloitte is really multifaceted. I actually started really in a more social media specific role at Deloitte 8 years ago and have been able to build up the social media capabilities and maturity of the organization globally, but also through my, network of marketers in different regions of Deloitte, and really proud of that. And then, of course, expanded the scope into other areas of digital, including web and content, and now lead a very talented team. I'm very lucky. I have wonderful people that work for me and with me, and we're really aimed at helping mature and transform the organization and the way that we do marketing through digital channels. And I'm very lucky. I love what I do. I always have. I feel a little bit like a bad millennial because I've been at this organization for 8 years, which is like unheard of now. Like you're always like jumping from organization to organization in my generation. But I think that just speaks to just, how much opportunity there's been for me and my career to grow and make an impact in the roles that I've had. So that's me. And I live in Austin and I work remotely on a global team. So I do a lot of Zooming in my role. And sometimes when my family asks what I do, because, digital marketing is still a little bit like, what does that mean? I typically say I just write a lot of emails for a living, which is not untrue. Digital marketing has its kind of sexy parts, but it also has its writing long email parts. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah. I love it. Well, I love that it's given you that opportunity over 8 years it's such a fast-paced, ever-changing world in which we operate in digital marketing. So really, really looking forward to hearing more from you over the course of our conversation this afternoon and this morning.
Yeah.
And then just by way of an introduction to myself, so my name is Katy Maloney. I am Global Managing Partner for B2B here at Wavemaker. Wavemaker are a global media agency who are famous for positively provoking growth for our clients across the industry and for ourselves. On a day-to-day basis, I lead our B2B proposition, and I support clients in this space, including Square, in kind of transforming their approach to brand, which is often very underinvested in the B2B sphere, and ultimately kind of quantify the impact of that awareness investment in their world, which, you know, as you all know, Meredith, from a B2B perspective, so often has much longer sales cycles and a payback loop. So it's a definite challenge for a lot of our B2B partners. And yeah, great pleasure for me to have a fellow female leader in B2B joining me. So thank you very much. We'll kick off. It's a huge pleasure to welcome you, Meredith. And we've mentioned already that you're joining us from Austin in Texas. So very keen to understand whether you're fresh from South by Southwest this year or any great inspiration for us to kick off.
Oh yeah, it was. So I did attend South by Southwest. It's actually, I think it's like my sixth year attending. We had a little bit of a break during the pandemic there, which was hard. It's really lights. I mean, I live in Austin, so I see the city transform with the conference coming into our city and hundreds of thousands of people now, you know, occupying our streets and brands taking over buildings that were previously your favorite restaurant. So there's just so much to, it's very exciting for someone who lives here to kind of see the transformation happen in the city that I live in. But I love the conference. I always see it as an opportunity to really level up in my industry. You know, even though I like to say that I stay abreast on, you know, the current trends and happenings in marketing, digital technology. It's always really cool to get perspectives from people who are really at the top of their game. The big kind of topics that I was certainly, you know, seeking out more information on was, of course, just the emerging technology. You know, metaverse was a big topic. AI, certainly ChatGPT was probably in every, you know, panel that I attended, whether it was on, you know, healthcare or creator economy, right? And one of the biggest things that was good to be reminded of in these conversations was, you know, technology kind of, in some cases, when we think about ChatGPT, we're like, wow, that's really exciting. And metaverse, wow, that's really exciting. But also, like, there's a little bit of a doomsday in the back of your head. Like, are we going to be like, is this the Matrix? Are we going to be controlled by robots someday? Like, what's happening? Are they going to take some of our jobs, even within marketing, right? Yeah. And I think one of the best quotes that I heard was this notion that technology is an enabler for living our life, not a replacement. Mm-hmm. And so how can we best leverage technology, particularly, and I think about in the context of my own role, to help me enable me to do marketing better, right? To enable me to market in a more inclusive way, potentially, and not necessarily a replacement for what I do, my team, or, you know, our organization does in the context of marketing. So a lot of conversations around that. And that was definitely inspiring and gave me a lot to think about.
Yeah, fantastic. There's definitely that kind of intersection between the sort of power of the machine and then human ingenuity and creativity, and what comes between those is fantastic, I think. And from a B2B perspective as well, and thinking about your role in Deloitte, you know, some of those emerging trends are really interesting to think about from a marketing perspective, but also from a kind of solutions perspective. So there's huge implication for things like the metaverse in sort of various products and services for B2B brands. And it's, very exciting, fast-paced world to kind of jump on. Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing the insight. Hopefully one day I'll be able to join you.
You got to come over, Katy.
So we'll jump into the questions. I'm really keen to hear from you, Meredith. So the first question is around your favorite marketing initiative that you're working on at the moment in your role.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely fortuitous that we're having this conversation during Women's History Month, because the campaign that I'm most excited about, I mean, let's be fair, there's a lot of great campaigns that my team is working on that I'm excited about, but one in particular is about women, right? And as a woman, it's always really inspiring and exciting to work on something in my day-to-day that's dedicated towards really elevating the stories of women. And what's really unique about I think the campaigns that Deloitte works on in general, and some of the most successful ones I've seen in my career there, is ones that elevate the stories of Deloitte women, right? Or Deloitte people in general, right? We have, over 400,000 people around the world that work for us. And we have a lot of stories to tell. And so the campaign I'm working on right now is a talent brand campaign that's actually in partnership with our businesses. And it's about sort of integrating this notion of women in emerging tech and how we can elevate the stories of the women that work for us who are either emerging leaders or leaders in their own right. Things like cloud, AI, even in some of our more traditional business areas like tax and consulting, but elevating their stories and showing Deloitte as a really bold and inclusive leader of elevating women in these emerging fields. And we're going to be doing that through personal storytelling of women, sharing advice that they would have told their younger selves, which I think is really powerful. Because certainly even 10, almost 12 years now into my career, what would I have told myself when I was 22, looking at this big career that I wanted? It's a really kind of cathartic and also like reflective notion that we can talk to our younger selves. So that's kind of the root and the genesis of the campaign, and we're really excited to launch that in June. So it's something we're actively working on, and shameless plug, follow us on Deloitte so you can see the launch of that. But I think the biggest or the most exciting part of it is just working with real women at Deloitte, right? Real women who have real stories, real advice to share, and hopefully women who are considering a job, not even necessarily at Deloitte, but in that field that has traditionally been underrepresented, right, by women, can see themselves in those women's stories. Like, I think that's the most powerful piece.
So powerful and really inspiring. And we'll look forward absolutely to seeing that launch in June and following it. I think it sounds like a really kind of authentic space for Deloitte as a firm to play in, to tell those stories and to empower women in the right way through your own employee network. So fantastic. And understanding that we're not launching this campaign until June, but just to give the guys on the session today a flavor of kind of what that means for Deloitte as a business. We've got a small clip of your International Women's Day campaign video for this year. So we'll play that now.
Yeah.
I'm a woman and I'm strong.
I'm a woman and when I was young, they called it bossy. Now they call it leadership.
I'm a woman and I'm paying.
I'm a woman and I'm nurturing. It's what makes me successful.
I'm a woman and I express my emotions. It helps me win.
Join the conversation.
Amazing. I love that. And I'm sure all women on the call can relate to those examples that were shared. So fantastic. Yeah. Awesome.
Stereotypes are, I think we've come a long way, but they're also still very ever present in our culture, in our work, so I think, the more that we can kind of elevate those and shed light on those is important. And, you know, I am sure everyone can relate to at least one of those scenarios where, you know, you were assumed some way, and maybe that it probably wasn't the case, right? So
absolutely. And that point nicely leads on to my second question for you, Meredith.
Yeah.
So I'm really keen to hear from you a key anecdote or moment throughout your career that's really changed what it means to you to be a woman in marketing.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think being a woman in marketing is not unlike being a woman in really any industry. There's at times it feels very inspiring and feels very, you know, validating. And other times it feels very lonely and frustrating. And, you know, I think one moment that stands out to me is probably about 7 years ago. So, you know, it was somewhat early on in my career. And I was, you know, more junior in my career, certainly. And I think that's important context for this anecdote. But, you know, I was invited to a meeting that was, you know, it was sort of a cross-functional meeting between, you know, sales, technology, and marketing. And we should also note that sales and technology are two teams and two, you know, functions where marketing is really plays a huge partnership role, right? Particularly now. And those are also industries that are heavily dominated by men. And so I was running to get to this meeting on time. Katy, something you should know for me is I am on time. I am usually never early. So I was rushing to get to this meeting on time. And I had really no context for who was going to be there. I knew this was going to be a meeting between, you know, our marketing organization and sales and tech. And I walk into the room right on time and everyone's seated. And the first thought I had was, whew, I made it. The second thought I had is, oh my God, there's a room full of 14 people here and there's one other woman.
Wow.
And and she was actually much more senior than I am. And I sit down and the meeting starts and I just can't shake that visual. I'm like, I'm sitting in this room and I'm like, does anyone else notice this? Like, you know, and that's sort of what I mean by the loneliness, right? It's just like, is anyone else picking up on the fact that we're in this like professional boardroom setting and there's it's completely unbalanced in terms of gender representation here. And my conclusion was probably no, like the 13 men sitting in this room probably aren't aware of this at all. It probably never even crossed their mind that this is strange, right? And I use that story, I mean, that was 7 years ago, but I think there's a story like that in 2023 for sure. And I sort of, that was the first time where I was like, okay, this is going to be different, right? I'm going to have more moments like this or variations of this moment in my career. And so I definitely talked to other women about it. And one thing that I learned in my conversations with other women is that, of course, when you experience something like that, it tells your brain that there's only so many places for us in these rooms, right? Clearly, because, you know, that's just been sort of the societal standard that's been set. So it creates this undue competition between women, right? As opposed to thinking kind of like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, like when will you feel like there's enough women on the Supreme Court? When there are 9, right? When they occupy every seat in the board on the Supreme Court, you know, that is the attitude I like to go into it. What am I satisfied? Not when it's even, when there's 13 women and 1 man in the room, right? But that when you're early on in your career, you think there's only so many places for women there. And it creates this competition, which is actually really toxic in an environment like this. And I know this is not the only industry where people feel that way. And so the best advice that I've gotten, I've tried to instill just in my own practice, in the women that I meet in my career, the women that work for me, is that we're not in competition with each other. Our role is to help raise each other up, bring each other along on this journey, because the reality is, even 7 years later, there are still lonely moments, and it doesn't have to be that way. So that moment really stuck with me, of like, oh, okay, so this is going to have to be a more intentional practice here than just a no-brainer. And I'm sure that that's the case for a lot of women.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I think, a really important narrative as well, when you talk about that toxicity potentially that exists between, well, maybe toxicity, but definitely competition, as you mentioned, when there's kind of lesser perceived roles available for women in certain situations, and also the optics of it from a kind of male perspective, whereby they perhaps don't even consider it as an issue because it's not affecting them directly, and they, to your point, probably didn't even notice that it was so imbalanced because it had no kind of impact on their day.
Right.
But yeah, it's I think it's such that narrative and that kind of cohesion between women and kind of championing each other is so important for, well, any marginalized group. We have to support each other. We have to kind of work together to break down barriers and to make change ultimately. So
absolutely
crazy. And I guess all these questions kind of feed in, but in terms of that, then, is there anything kind of that you are unlearning as a woman in marketing? So either kind of an attitude or a habit that you're fighting against, or perhaps just a stereotype or a bias against women that you come up against kind of more too often than not?
What's interesting is I talk about, I feel like the more I talk about it, the more I'll like untrain myself to do it, because like I'm embarrassed by this. And so we're getting vulnerable, Katie. But it's actually not necessarily exclusive to my work kind of personality and the way that I operate in the work environment. But what I found myself doing is if there's something said either in a work environment or in a non-work environment by a man that is not blatantly offensive, but perhaps tone deaf, perhaps insensitive, and I default to not calling it out, not sort of challenging that thought. I default, for whatever reason, not for whatever reason, because this is what we're trained to do, to make that person not feel bad about what they said. Right? Like, I'm like, oh, like I want to deflect, maybe add some comedic humor to it to try to like make it okay that happened. Right? Or that was said. And I don't want to make the man feel uncomfortable. Like, what is that? Like, why do I do that? And every time I leave a scenario like that, I'm like, why did you do that? Like, you should have said it because you should have treated it as like a teachable moment, right? That is the case. And I think, there is some privilege in me being a bit more senior in my career now, where I feel more comfortable. But imagine, a woman who's early on in their career, like, of course they're doing that. They don't want to ruffle feathers. That is like that's a very common sort of trope that we're told as women, like, don't, ruffle feathers, don't, keep cool, calm, and collected. Right. And so, but that is still something I'm unlearning in my own, at work, in my personal life, right? Of not trying to kind of, to call out what's wrong in the moment, as opposed to making it seem okay. And that is a challenge for me. And I consider myself a pretty outspoken person. But it's something that I'm very self-critical on a lot. And it's always after the fact, of course, because in that moment, I just have that instinctive reaction to make everything okay.
Yeah. And I think, that's totally relatable, and kind of a similar narrative that we're having across, all of these areas where we need to be calling out, inappropriate behavior or things that have gone before as given that just shouldn't be the case moving forward. And that's that hindsight moment where I bet you think of an amazing comeback kind of 30 minutes after the fact, like, that was so good. But I think it's also something like our society as women, like historically our role has been to kind of make people comfortable and to feel, you don't want to cause unease. It's like a very hard thing to do, and particularly in that professional circumstance whereby you might be impacting depending on who the conversation is with, where you're impacting your growth trajectory, or
totally
perspective from that individual. So yeah, I absolutely hear you. Thank you for sharing.
Oh yeah. And now I'm saying it live in front of an audience. So this is really like this is accountability.
Yeah.
Anyone on this live stream sees me, trying to make people comfortable, call me out and be like, Meredith, what do you really think?
We're uncomfortable with our opinions. That's it.
Yeah.
And then I guess with that in mind, kind of how do you really see our role as women kind of in the industry in 2023 and beyond? Like, what is our, how do we make that difference?
Yeah, what's interesting, and this is also kind of inspired by my time at South by Southwest, because it's a great question, because certainly I think women in marketing, women are actually dominating marketing percentage wise. Like I look to my left and my right and I see a lot of women. I look at people who work for me. Even at Deloitte, I see a lot of women as leaders in marketing, which is very inspiring, right? So overall, we're here. Right? We are present. We are working hard for that money, right? Here. But still the leadership composition is still heavily dominated by men. So I'm sure a lot of women in my role, in my position, they report to men, right? Or the sort of the person that is calling the shots is a man. And that is still something that I think we need to work on. And then I mentioned, the intersection of marketing and sales and technology, right? And what I really thought about coming out of South by Southwest and talking about technology so much, right, is that technology, these platforms in which we market on, social media platforms certainly, but also like the tools in which we use to market, right? CRM systems, marketing automation tools, right? All of these tools and capabilities were mostly built by men. Right? We as women who are dominating this field, staying on top of our game, being the emerging leaders in this space, are working on tools, doing our jobs through tools and technologies that were built mostly by men. Right? And so I would love to see women and I think the rise in women in STEM and the work that we're doing there is really important, because like the tools that are being built by women are then being used by women. And it's just, I mean, there of course is gender biases built into people who are creating systems, creating technology. If there's not women in the room, or if it's not a woman who's building it, of course there's going to be implications there. And so I'd love to see that, because there's already natural integration in these types of, functionalities. I'd love to see women dominating that space. And we're already starting to see that. But I think it just stuck with me. I'm like, gosh, I'm using all these tools that were built by men. And what would it look like if a woman was building these tools for an industry that is so dominated by women?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thought. And actually, so our global head of innovation at Wavemaker is a lady called Sarah Salter, who's fantastic. And she actually hosted a panel on International Women's Day to talk to female founders of kind of tech startups and initiatives. And I think that's so important. And I think a lot of it comes from the funding and the backing and the support and all of this stuff starts at grassroots level that we need to invest in to
it runs deep
to do it. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It's like, well, if we need more women in tech and founders, and we need more women venture capitalists, like then we need more, like, it's like, and then we need all of these things. Right. And it does become a bit overwhelming, but to quote the great Ruth Bader Ginsburg once again, I'm mentioning her twice now. She said, "Real change happens one step at a time," and I truly believe that. I don't think that I certainly am not going to take on boiling the ocean. However, I can impact this industry and the women in my industry, even just through small incremental changes. I'm calling that a win, because that's, I think, how real change happens long term.
Absolutely agree. I think reading between the lines, what you're saying, Meredith, is that women should really rule the world.
Well, obviously, Katie, I mean, yes.
Okay, a couple final questions then. So one I wanted to chat to you about is just a great example from a brand that you've either worked on or seen that you're passionate about that really champions equity for women.
Yeah. So obviously we do a lot of great work at Deloitte. And so this is not to diminish that impact. Certainly we've seen some examples already, but a brand that I have long time followed and been so inspired by, and particularly around their storytelling, is Dove. Right. Dove is fascinating to me. Dove went from being a women's hygienic brand to like a true women's empowerment brand. Like I have to remind myself that like, oh, right, Dove sells deodorant. Right. Because in my head, I'm like, Dove tells real stories, gripping stories of women. And they got in early, right? They got in when there was not a lot of brands talking about that. And it was provocative and it was raw. And it really spoke to me as a consumer. And then the second thought I had was, oh, I'm out of shampoo. I should probably go buy some Dove shampoo, right? So it did its job, but the most memorable piece of that of Dove to me is not necessarily how amazing their product is, which it is, but the how good of a storyteller they are and how real they are when they approach a topic that is potentially somewhat like polarizing or controversial. And so I've always respected their work and I'm very inspired by it. And I'd be lying if I said, their focus on real women and real stories, that has absolutely inspired the work that, I try to influence in my own role of telling real stories and not using sort of hypothetical scenarios of women or people. I think that matters.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that authenticity point and them
Exactly.
having a real kind of role. And I think we've got an example now of their recent campaign that's driving, real tangible change in this space.
Yeah.
Maybe just the blue. My dad always told me that I should love my hair. So I did.
Wait for me right here for a second. Excuse me, sir. We have a strict hair policy here. I'm afraid I can't let you attend school today.
Don't forget your hat. Even when it wasn't easy.
We talked about this. You can't wear braids if you want to walk at graduation.
Even when no one else did. My dad always told me that I should fight for my hair. So I am.
Very, very powerful and actually very sad to see that still exists. That leads me to my final question. I think they're telling a story from kind of youth through to your professional life. But what do you see from a kind of Gen Z and a Gen Alpha perspective in terms of their expectations from brands, and how are you kind of adapting based on that in your role at Deloitte specifically?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think also just that speaks to just like what you're conditioned to do or conditioned to think or feel as a young person carries throughout your entire career. When we talked about trying to make people feel comfortable, right? Like that was something that was conditioned early on, and that, obviously has carried through. So that's really important. So yeah, Gen Z, God, I love this generation. They are they're so steadfast in what they want and feel and believe. As a millennial, I'm looking to them for a lot of inspiration in terms of kind of zero tolerance for certain things. And I think particularly in considering hiring Gen Z and attracting Gen Z. So I think there's kind of two sides of the coin. From a B2B perspective, a lot of our work with Gen Z is around hiring them, right? They're sort of the next generation of leaders we see. Certainly from a B2C perspective, Gen Z is having a lot more purchasing power, right? So we must attract Gen Z because they're going to be buying our products or services, right? But either way, if through either lens, Gen Z is putting purpose at a premium, right? And so they are much more loyal to brands where that aligns with their purpose and their values, right? And increasingly more so, those values are around the environment, inclusivity, social impact. And so in order to play in this space, both as a from a talent acquisition perspective or just as a customer acquisition perspective, your brand is being kind of scrutinized against your values. And here's the interesting part, right? Like we look at campaigns like Dove, we look at other campaigns where, brands are coming out against, discrimination, activism. And we see a huge rise in activism with brands, particularly coming out of the pandemic. And that's all great, right? But what I think my generation was certainly looking for something like that, looking for brands who care, right? But Gen Z is looking for brands who act. And there is a distinct difference, certainly, right? Are you really drinking your own Kool-Aid here, right? Because it's one thing to put out an ad campaign and talk about, how inclusive your company is, but when that 22-year-old arrives at the company and they look to their left and their right and they don't see anyone that looks like them, then that's not okay with them, right? And they will make that known, right? I also think what's interesting about Gen Z is the feedback loop is instantaneous, right? Yeah. So you as a brand, right, whether again from a consumer perspective or a talent acquisition perspective, they're going to tell you how they feel, and it will likely be in a public forum. So navigating that feedback loop with this generation, I think, is really interesting. From my perspective, I'm a glass half full person. I think it's the best, field research we could possibly do. The best focus group is this generation and how they're interacting on these platforms, what they're saying on these platforms, what they're interested in. I think it tells us so much about the future of what people care about, where they're prioritizing, their values and thoughts. And so I'm excited about it. I am a Gen Z enthusiast, if you will.
Absolutely, I agree. And I think you're right. It's all about kind of listening to their perspectives and making sure that we translate those views into kind of real action. Absolutely. Meredith, thank you. We've covered a huge amount of ground here, so thank you so much. We've touched on some really kind of important topics, I think, and I really appreciate your answers and your honesty today. I'm just going to cover a couple of takeaways that I noted, which I think kind of came out throughout our discussion and are somewhat interlinked, but keen to hear your thoughts. I think the first was all around kind of this ingrained pressure that we feel as women in terms of, to your example earlier, being outnumbered in reflecting a kind of broader group opinion, or having that pressure to, reflect the opinions of your peers in a group of males often. And also kind of feeling that need to comply with a status quo versus calling out inequity that still very much does seem to persist in the workplace. And I think that gradual change that you touched on is really important in moving that along. I think the other thing was around kind of the rate in which we're seeing and experiencing positive change, and all of the great things that you've talked about in these areas is, or seems to be, based on what we've talked about today, determined by kind of the importance that companies are putting on their own DE&I initiatives and their approach to recruiting and nurturing the future talent that you talk about that will help, tangibly drive change, which I think is really critical. And then understanding kind of within that future generation how brands can play a role in empowering them as the leaders of tomorrow. So the Dove example that we talked about, they kind of become an empowerment brand, and that sort of importance of purpose, which is fully intertwined with DE&I and kind of driving that change across the industry and beyond is so critical. One of my takeaways.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, you know, I keep going back to that anecdote around being in the boardroom, you know, another sort of the weight that you feel. And this is not just as a woman, I think any underrepresented group or person would feel this way, is that not only are you alone in that situation, but now you're being just essentially asked by the sheer kind of ratio to represent an entire group as a single person, right? And that's not really equitable or fair, right? So when companies are thinking about equity, right, thinking about building inclusive culture, right, it's not about just having that one woman or, you know, that one person representing that specific minority group, right? It's about truly building, you know, through the levels, right? Like true inclusive groups, right? Because then you create this dynamic where that one person representing that specific group is now responsible for speaking on behalf of that entire group, which is not going to really drive the change that we want to see. And so I think that's an important context to think through, right? And again, you know, it's better than not having anybody in the room for sure, but I think we can do better. I think we can go a step further and think about, you know, really creating an inclusive culture beyond just having a single representation of a woman in a room. And now, you know, we've checked the box on inclusivity, right? So, yeah.
Oh my gosh, 100%. And I think it's a really important point to finish on, and like what defines that difference between that distinction between equality and equity. I think that balance of responsibility is really critical. So amazing. I mean, thank you so much, Meredith. I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your time today. It's been so great. And yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. This has been a great way to spend a Tuesday. Thank you.
Glad to hear it. And for everyone kind of joining us today, thank you as well for your time. Please do kind of tell us what you took away from this conversation in the comments. We'll be sharing the full recording shortly, and, you know, keep in touch. Please do reach out to myself or to Meredith, and, you know, shameless plug for Wavemaker, but do follow Wavemaker Global for regular insights about media marketing, technology, and all of their intersections. But that is all from us. So thank you, everybody, and take care.